comes every weekend to our project, and he is very, very proud of our accomplishment. His goal and dream to have his signature on the map of Kuwait. On Google Earth, you can see us. You can see us, alhamdulillah, all over. It's going to be the biggest water canals project, I think, in the Middle East.
Kuwait is carving a new coastline out of pure desert, sucking millions of tons of sand from the earth to build a 200-kilometer waterfront city where summer heat hits 122 degrees. Instead of pushing land into the sea, they're pulling the sea inland, doubling the nation's shoreline in a way no Gulf state has attempted. Billions have already reshaped the dunes, but one question now shadows the project. Will this engineered oasis become a thriving city or the desert's most expensive illusion? The desert that shouldn't have been touched. For decades, Kuwait's southern sands looked like nothing more than endless beige under the scorching Gulf sun. Quietly, planners realized the desert held a hidden opportunity, a way to transform a lifeless stretch of sand into 200 kilometers of new coastline. At first, it sounded impossible. How do you take land with zero water and turn it into a waterfront long enough to rival entire countries? The secret was quite simple. Kuwait had space, but almost no shoreline for real estate or tourism. The soft desert sand could be reshaped. Engineers realized that if they carved deep channels into the desert and let seawater flow in, they could create lagoons, canals, and artificial islands, places for homes, marinas, and businesses that didn't exist before. The plan evolved into what we now know as Sabah Al Ahmad Sea City. Instead of building islands out at sea, Kuwait would bring the sea inland. Every channel, every bend, every inlet was mapped carefully. Experts studied tides, water circulation, and the strength of desert soil. One wrong calculation could have caused flooding or collapsed banks. Skeptics laughed at first. Could a small country really reshape geography on this scale? When approval finally came, the impossible became real. A gamble so bold it could change Kuwait's economy and its image forever. The quiet desert was no longer just sand. It had become the foundation for one of the most ambitious coastal engineering projects in the world, where engineers turned imagination into reality. The plan. When the first drawings of the project were laid out on the table, they looked like something pulled from a futuristic magazine. Long sweeping channels bent in every direction, all feeding into a larger body of water that did not even exist yet. For many people in the room, it was the first time they realized Kuwait was not talking about a small coastal adjustment. This was a redesign of the map itself. The engineers explained that the only way to create enough waterfront for housing, marinas, and commercial spaces was to bring the sea far into the desert, not by a few meters, but by kilometers. The solution was a grid of man-made inlets cut directly into the sand. Each inlet needed to be deep and wide enough to let seawater travel smoothly without stagnating. It had to flow naturally, almost as if nature had carved it itself. The team studied how water behaves when moving across flat, hot terrain. They tested how fast the Gulf water would warm up, how much oxygen it would hold, and how quickly it could refresh itself during tidal cycles. These details mattered because poor circulation could lead to dead water zones or unhealthy marine conditions. This is where the coral-inspired layout came in. Coral branches split into smaller arms to capture as much sunlight and water flow as possible. The architects borrowed that structure and used it to maximize shoreline length. Instead of a handful of straight canals, they created a branching system that expanded the water's reach in every direction. Each branch produced more edges, and more edges meant more waterfront that could later turn into homes, parks, and docks. Nothing about this design was purely decorative. Every curve was tested for hydrodynamics. Every branching point was measured for how it would affect the current speed. The engineers made sure tidal movements from the Gulf could push in and pull out without causing erosion, or leaving behind pools of warm, still water. By the time the final plans were finished, what once seemed impossible had turned into a carefully designed system capable of supporting a whole new coastal city. The quiet desert was ready to come alive with flowing water channels. Approval shocked even Kuwaitis. When Kuwait finally approved the project, even people who had followed the discussions for years were surprised. Massive construction is nothing new in the Gulf, but this plan stood out because it wasn't just about building towers or reclaiming a strip of land. It's reshaping an entire section of the country by cutting deep into the desert and letting the sea fill the space. The cost alone placed it among the most ambitious land modification efforts in the region, and that scale made the approval feel like a bold step rather than a routine decision. Inside government circles, the politicians pushing for it argued that the country needed a long-term strategy that went beyond oil revenue. They saw the southern desert as a blank canvas. If a functioning coastal city could rise from an area that once had no water, it would prove that Kuwait could compete with regional developments in tourism, housing, and infrastructure. Some ministers described it as a chance to redefine how Kuwaitis interacted with the coastline. Instead of being limited to a narrow stretch along the Gulf, the nation could suddenly have an entirely new waterfront community designed from scratch. Not everyone was convinced. Critics questioned whether the engineering risks were worth it and whether the money could have been invested elsewhere. On social media and in local conversations, people bantered that Kuwait was trying to move the ocean the way other countries move soil. Others worried about how the environment would react to deep channels running into the desert, especially in a region with sensitive marine conditions. Still, the technical studies showed that water would circulate properly and the environmental impact could be managed, which helped secure approval. When it was finally approved, the project had moved from a bold idea to a symbol of Kuwait's ambition. The monster machines arrive. When the heavy equipment finally started arriving, people living near the project site got their first real sense of how massive the operation would be. The stars of the show were the dredgers, huge industrial machines normally seen deep offshore. They had towering control cabins, conveyor systems, and suction arms that stretched out like mechanical limbs built to reshape the land. Calling them floating buildings wasn't an exaggeration. Some were long enough to match the height of multi-story structures laid on their side. They had to remove enormous volumes of desert sand to create the canals that would eventually carry seawater inland. Dredgers are designed for this kind of work. They use powerful pumps to pull sand, silt, and loose material through giant pipes, grinding and transferring it with remarkable speed. In Kuwait's case, the machines were tuned to handle dry desert terrain that would soon become submerged channels. Crews described the first days of operation as both surreal and technically impressive. Watching a dredger slice into untouched dunes and pull them apart with industrial precision showed how quickly the landscape could change. From a distance, the work looked almost effortless, but behind the scenes, engineers carefully monitored every meter of sand that was removed. Each cut had to follow precise measurements to match hydrodynamic models and ensure water would flow properly once the Gulf filled the inlets. Thousands of readings checked that the soil layers behaved as expected. With every pass of the machines, the desert slowly lost its familiar flat shape, transforming into a complex network of deep channels. The sand extraction begins. Once the dredgers were fully positioned, the real transformation started. The first cuts into the desert were deep, straight channels that looked almost unnatural compared to the gentle slopes of the surrounding dunes. Engineers had mapped out the exact paths long before the machines touched the ground, so every trench followed a precise route that would one day guide seawater into the interior of the project. As the suction arms lowered, the pumps roared to life, pulling sand upward in steady, powerful streams. This was not a slow excavation. The equipment removed material at a rate that would have taken traditional machinery months to achieve. The extracted sand did not go to waste. It was transported through long pipes to designated areas where it was compacted and reused. Some was processed to create stable embankments for future housing zones. Other portions became part of man-made islands and protective barriers that would help shape the city's layout. Engineers relied on dynamic compaction systems to strengthen the relocated sand, making sure it could support roads, buildings, and utilities. The process was part excavation, part reconstruction, turning loose desert grains into engineered landforms. Workers who had spent their lives around Kuwait's flat, predictable desert were amazed by the changes. As the channels grew deeper, the edges of the sand moved in ways no one had seen before. Ridges fell inward, slopes slid away, and the once solid ground began to act like something lighter and more fluid. This is where the expression "collapse into water" came from. Even before the Gulf reached the site, the desert was already taking the shape of a landscape ready for water. Each day, the area looked less like a dry desert and more like an empty blueprint waiting to be filled with tides. A new coastline starts appearing. When the first paths were finally ready, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. Engineers opened controlled gates that allowed seawater from the Gulf to move into the freshly carved channels. It started slowly, almost cautiously, as if the sea was testing unfamiliar ground. Then the flow strengthened, spreading through the network of cuts that had been shaped with months of planning and excavation. Watching saltwater run across an area that had been dry for centuries felt almost unreal to the crews on site. They were witnessing the desert receive its first tides. As the water advanced, the transformation was immediate. Sections of land that had been nothing but pale sand began to reflect the sky. What used to look like a construction zone turned into a series of calm blue waterways. The channels widened as the water settled into their contours, and the new lagoons and inlets took on the same color and texture as natural Gulf shoreline engineers monitored the flow to confirm that the tidal movements were circulating correctly. Early tests showed that the water quality stayed stable, proving the hydrodynamic design worked as planned. The impact went beyond the landscape. With every meter of water filling the channels, the amount of usable waterfront grew. In real estate, shoreline is one of the most valuable features a country can have. Kuwait had always been limited by a short natural coast, but this project was creating new shoreline faster than anyone had expected. Investors who had once been doubtful began taking notice. What had looked like a dusty excavation site was starting to look like the early stages of a coastal city. For workers who had spent months surrounded by sand and machinery, the arrival of water changed everything. The real estate frenzy ignites. Once the water filled the new channels and the coastline's layout became visible, the business world responded quickly. Even though the project was still years from completion, investors were already examining the master plan. In Kuwait, waterfront property has always been highly valuable because the natural shoreline is limited. Now, the country was creating an entirely new supply from scratch, and that alone transformed the real estate market almost overnight. Developers began reserving plots long before any buildings were permitted. The early interest was driven by the simple fact that the master plan laid out thousands of residential and commercial lots touching water. Buyers could see where the roads would go, where the marinas would sit, and how each neighborhood would be connected by the new canal system. The idea of owning land beside lagoons that had not even existed a year earlier created a sense of urgency. What surprised many observers was how quickly these plots were claimed. Entire sections of the development were booked based purely on the projected layout. The expectation of long-term value made the market competitive from the start. Some buyers were thinking about building luxury homes, while others saw potential in rental properties or hospitality projects. International investors also joined in, noting that the project's scale made it one of the largest engineered waterfront expansions in the Gulf. The momentum kept building as more phases of the project were revealed. The promise of nearly 200 kilometers of new shoreline meant that Kuwait was about to offer more waterfront access than some countries with significantly longer natural coasts. Each new announcement added fuel to the growing competition. Prices rose as demand increased, and the early investors looked confident that they had stepped in at the right moment. Behind the scenes, planners continued updating infrastructure maps to keep up with growing interest. Roads, utilities, and public facilities were redesigned to match the speed at which land was being claimed. By the time the first foundations were laid, the excitement had already set the tone. The project was no longer just a bold engineering effort. It had become one of the most active and fast-moving real estate markets in Kuwait in years. Fish returned to places they never existed. Once the water fully settled into the new channels, something unexpected happened. Marine life started moving in as if the coastline had always existed. Within weeks, algae began to take hold along the edges of the canals, forming the first building blocks of an ecosystem. Tiny fish, attracted to the new plant growth and calm waters, began appearing in small schools. Scientists monitoring the project were amazed at how quickly life adapted to the artificial environment. As the months passed, the fish population grew, and larger species began exploring the lagoons. Crabs, shrimps, and small reef fish established themselves in shallow areas, while predatory species like groupers and snappers were spotted moving in. As the food chain stabilized, the new waterways were carefully designed to mimic natural tidal flow and water circulation, which meant oxygen levels stayed healthy and the water did not stagnate. This careful engineering made it possible for marine life to thrive in a space that, just a year before, had been nothing but dry desert. The success of these initial migrations caught the attention of marine biologists across the Gulf region. They had expected some life to return over time, but the speed and diversity exceeded projections. The artificial coastline became a living laboratory, showing how human intervention, when thoughtfully planned, could create habitats rather than destroy them. Bird species soon followed, feeding on the abundant fish, adding another layer to the ecosystem. Local fishermen began noticing new fishing spots forming naturally in the inlets. The project showed that with careful planning and environmental monitoring, man-made developments could work alongside nature in ways that once seemed impossible. What had been a barren desert was now alive with movement, color, and sound, and scientists' early predictions about the ecosystem were already proving accurate. Unexpected side effects. Once the seawater began circulating through the new channels, the project revealed effects that no one had fully anticipated. One of the first surprises came from the wind engineers had the lagoons would influence predicted local airflow, but the reality exceeded expectations. The presence of large, calm bodies of water created subtle pressure differences, altering wind patterns along the edges of the desert areas that were once dry and windswept, now experienced calmer, sometimes more turbulent gusts, depending on the time of day and tide. Temperature changes created new challenges. Shallow, sunlit water warmed during the day and released heat at night, forming pockets of warmer or cooler air in the surrounding areas. In some spots, the new waterways even caused morning fog, something rarely seen in this part of Kuwait. Locals reported waking to mist, rising over stretches of desert that had only ever known dry heat. Scientists found these microclimates fascinating because they showed how man-made water systems can influence weather in unexpected ways. Wildlife began responding to the changing environment as well. Some species adapted quickly, using the new water and the vegetation growing along the canals. Birds that had never been seen in the desert started visiting regularly, while small mammals moved closer to the wetlands to take advantage of the transformed landscape. At the same time, other species struggled with the altered temperatures and wind patterns, forcing them to relocate or adapt in less visible ways. Biologists pointed out that while the artificial coastline brought many benefits, it also had ripple effects across the wider ecosystem, showing that even carefully planned human projects can create surprising environmental consequences. The engineering risks hit hard. As the water continued to fill the newly dug channels, engineers encountered a challenge they didn't predict. Parts of the artificial banks, especially those built from relocated desert sand, began showing signs of instability. Sections that had seemed solid during excavation started to slump, edges crumbling under the pressure of the newly introduced seawater. Even with months of planning, desert sand can behave unpredictably when saturated, and the project quickly demonstrated just how delicate the balance between human engineering and natural forces can be. To address these early failures, emergency reinforcements were put into place. Heavy machinery poured in additional sand and gravel, while compacting and stabilizing materials were layered to support the banks. In some areas, concrete retaining walls were temporarily installed to prevent further collapse. Engineers monitored every section closely, using sensors to track soil movement and water pressure. The work was meticulous because a single failure could trigger a chain reaction, potentially causing sections of the canal to wash out or flood surrounding areas. This phase of the project revealed the true complexity of building on desert terrain. The ground that had once seemed stable turned out to be a constantly shifting foundation, once exposed to water. Desert sand, while easy to move during excavation, lacks the cohesion of natural soil when soaked, making it vulnerable to erosion and slumping. Engineers had to adapt rapidly, combining traditional civil engineering techniques with innovative approaches specifically designed for the Gulf's unique environment. Global reputation. As news of Kuwait's Coastline project spread, it quickly captured the attention of governments and engineering organizations around the world. Delegations from countries across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East traveled to Kuwait to see the project firsthand. They wanted to understand how a nation could take desert land, carve it into intricate channels, and turn it into a functioning, sustainable coastal city. The sheer scale of the work, combined with its ambitious environmental planning, made it unlike anything most engineers had ever encountered. Kuwait's ability to reshape its geography changed how the world saw the country. It was no longer just a small Gulf state dependent on oil. Instead, it became a symbol of innovation, showing that careful planning, engineering skill, and major investment could literally change the map. International media and technical journals highlighted the project as a case study in human ingenuity, pointing out the mix of large-scale dredging, soil stabilization, water management, and urban planning. The project showed that desert landscapes, often seen as limitations, could be turned into valuable, functional spaces when approached with vision and precision. Engineers called it one of the most ambitious coastline creation projects ever attempted. Unlike traditional land reclamation, which extends from existing shorelines into the sea, Kuwait's approach brought the Gulf inland, creating hundreds of kilometers of artificial waterfront in the desert. The project relied on careful modeling of tides, water quality, and soil behavior to keep the canals stable and livable. Advanced monitoring systems tracked water circulation and bank strength, giving scientists and engineers data rarely available on projects of this scale. By drawing international attention and professional admiration, Kuwait positioned itself as a leader in coastal engineering. The project became more than just real estate or national development. It set a benchmark for countries looking to expand habitable land without harming natural ecosystems. Observers were impressed that a small desert nation could combine vision, technology, and ambition to achieve something once thought impossible. The final look, nobody saw coming. When the project reached its later stages, the scale of the transformation was impossible to miss. From above, the new coastline stretched in twisting, branching patterns that looked like a massive maze carved from the desert. What had once been flat, endless sand was now a network of waterways, inlets, and artificial peninsulas, each carefully designed to maximize waterfront access. Years of planning and excavation had turned into a functional, striking landscape that combined natural water flow with space for urban development. As the canals filled and the first plots became ready for construction, property values began rising faster than anyone expected. Investors who had secured land early saw its value increase almost immediately. Waterfront lots, once considered speculative because the land did not exist a year earlier, became some of the most sought after in the region. Real estate agents reported that demand far outpaced supply, with both local and international buyers eager for a piece of the new shoreline. The rarity of the plots made even small parcels highly competitive. What started as an idea met with jokes and skepticism, people literally saying Kuwait was trying to move the ocean, had now become a global benchmark. Urban planners, engineers, and environmental scientists studied the project as a model for sustainable land creation. It showed how careful engineering could turn barren desert into high-value, usable land while protecting water circulation and encouraging early ecosystem development. The public, who once saw the project as an over-ambitious gamble, now had to reconsider. The artificial coastline had become a living, dynamic cityscape, complete with working waterways, emerging marine life, and thriving residential areas. Kuwait had achieved something remarkable. It had turned doubt into admiration, and an empty desert into a thriving, tangible asset. What once seemed impossible had become a vivid example of how vision, engineering, and investment can truly reshape geography. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.